Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, where we discuss and dissect the most topical issues in the energy sector. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Alexandra Härmatis, Senior Carbon Trader at Vertis Environmental Finance, about some of the changes coming to the EU's emissions trading scheme, the EU's cornerstone climate policy. This week, we've seen reports of Indian steel and other metal companies rushing to secure renewable energy deals to reduce their net carbon emissions and avoid penalties under Europe's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, also known as CBAM, which comes into full effect in 2026. This is just one of the many other regulatory changes to the carbon market we're going to see coming over the next 3 years, and which I'll be discussing today with Alexandra. Last week, at our Nordic Energy Day in Oslo, Alexandra spoke about the EU ETS changes and how emissions allowances will impact other sectors, such as aviation. Here's what she had to say.
In 2026, airlines, who until now they have received almost all of their corresponding emissions for free in allowances, they need to cover their full amount of emissions in 2026. They will receive nothing for free. And the maritime sector will also be fully included in the EU ETS, and they will add roughly 90 million tons of demand per year.
So what does this mean for the industry, and what does the future of the carbon market look like under these changes? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Alexandra now to discuss this in more detail. A warm welcome to you, Alexandra. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard. Happy to be here.
I know you often talk about how the purpose of your job is ultimately to make yourself redundant, but could you explain a bit more what you mean and more about what you do as well?
Well, on me being redundant, I hope not, even though I do hope so. Why I'm saying that is basically because we are looking to make our globe greener, right? And we are a part of that, and the EU ETS scheme is a part of this green transition. And at Vertis, we are helping companies to plan and structure their EUA purchases in the best way possible so that they can comply with the EU ETS and they can do it in the most cost-efficient way possible. How we do that? Well, we provide them with the market insights and analysis for them to make the best decisions possible for their EUA purchases.
Yep, fine, absolutely. I mean, the EU ETS is at the sort of pretty much at the heart of everything we're going to talk about today, Alexandra. So, it's the cornerstone, the central plank of the EU's climate policy. And if we, turn to prices now, Alexandra, the prices have been fairly choppy, certainly this year. Where are we now, and what's driving carbon prices?
Well, if we look back a little bit, so historically the gas and power prices, they've always had a strong influence on the carbon market. So if gas price increases and coal price is steady or declining, the utilities will tend to burn coal instead of gas, right? So fuel switching. And that results in a higher emission and also, of course, in a demand for EUAs, which will increase the price in the end. And this means that there is a positive correlation between the price of gas and EUAs, since gas is actually requiring less EUAs and it's less carbon intensive. So lately we've seen the correlation between the months ahead gas price and the EUAs being particularly strong. And as you know, and you already said that, the gas prices are fluctuating quite a bit. And it has a lot to do with the gas storage levels in Europe. They are currently unusually high. And of course, we have the uncertainty of supply from the Ukraine-Russia region and of LNG. The fundamentals of carbon emission versus the EUA supply, they are the basic drivers in the market. And as carbon emissions from utilities have dropped by over 20% in the first half of 2024, we also have additional auction volume from the Repower EU initiative, and this is making the supply-demand balance close to neutral at the moment. But as we also discussed at the Nordic Energy Day, we are seeing prices around 70 euros still. And many people are asking themselves, how can this be, right? This is also due to that we are actually seeing 3-year high open interest on future contracts. And from what we can tell from our side, some compliance entities are coming back into the market, and they are hedging to make sure that they are at least partly covered for the future and for these regulatory changes that are coming up. And these regulatory changes are of course, made to tighten the market supply considerably, and that is from 2026 and onwards. And on the other side, we have speculators and hedge funds who, of course, play an important role in the market with overall net positions of bet being negative all of 2024, according to the commitment of traders' data that is published every week.
We'll go into detail about that maybe a bit further along, Alexandra. But when you mention these policy changes, can you just remind us what is the Repower EU? What's that all about?
Well, on the carbon market, Repower EU initiative is taking out 20 billion worth of EUAs from the auction volume from 2027 to 2030, and is putting it into the market and the auction volume for 2024 to 2026.
And this is to finance renewable energy projects within the EU?
Exactly. So this is going to finance the green transition, basically, yeah. The issue here is that the price of the EUA is not high enough because the EU stipulated a 75 euro carbon price, and we're not there. So there have been speculations about extending the input of allowances into the auction volume, or making it even bigger. That was on the agenda for this fall, so maybe we would take out more volume just to make sure that we get these 20 billion in the end, but nothing has happened so far. So let's see what happens in the future.
So if we, you mentioned gas, and that's obviously clearly the chief driver here. Is that, is it still, that's the main carbon price driver, and fears that are driving the gas market are also driving carbon? I mean, you rightly pointed out that storage levels are incredibly full for the time of year, unusually so. That's never happened before, and this could be kind of the bearish impact, right? And but also the fears about the cutoff of flows from Russia through Ukraine is more maybe a fear that is causing prices to move upwards. Would that be albeit a crude summary, would that be a fair assessment, Alexandra?
Yeah, so for now, carbon itself doesn't really have a clear direction, right? So it's looking for someone to lead it. And as I said before, it has always been and is being highly impacted by the power prices and especially gas. So yes, but fear is just fear, right? But it's real. And it might also be changing as we speak, because hedge funds' position on gas, they're being on a record high. And then we can also, make the question or ask ourselves the question, how much more upside can there really be, right? Especially as the fundamental flows are not impacted, at least not yet. And also, if it's all fear-based, fear has to remain pretty high for the price to keep pushing higher. And as I said, how far can it go? So does this mean that the CO2, so carbon, will decorrelate anytime soon from the gas price? Probably not yet, but it's hard to know if and when a possible decorrelation could take place, because for now, gas is still impacting power enough to drive the hedging on EUAs.
Perfect. And we've also, we're getting reports, especially regarding to Germany, of a sort of gloomy macroeconomic picture, and also, a growing expansion of renewable energy. Is that going to drive a carbon price slump, do you think, this year and into 2025?
I mean, what we can definitely say is that the emissions will drop significantly, and that we've already seen the first half of 2024, and that would be a bearish signal. But we also know that the market doesn't only trade on fundamentals, and therefore our outlook, at least for the rest of 2024, is pretty neutral. So let's say sideways. There is still no real recovery within the industry, and power emissions are at record lows, and they're likely to finish off the year at minus 20%, as I already mentioned, and that's compared to last year's 24%. And this is something that the market, and we have never experienced before, And now this is happening 2 years in a row.
I mean, that's good news, Alexandra. You know, power emissions are coming down. This is what the system was intended to do, right? To drive emissions down.
Of course, but it also means that we are still not really recovered when it comes to the industry, right? So if we also see higher emissions, we can also come to the conclusion normally that the industry is picking up and we actually have a larger output from there. So yes, it is positive for decarbonisation. And we also see, of course, really, really high output from renewable energy production. So yes, both positive and negative to answer your question, right? But we might also, let's see if we see a cold winter. We don't know that yet, so everything is speculation. But that might also give the demand a little push if we see more fossil power production, because right now it's very much out of the money due to a lot of renewable energy on the market and also prices being really high.
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at the sort of coming 6 months, I mean, you mentioned your forecast for 2024, but if we go a little bit further, you know, in 2025, for example, do you see prices returning to the euro, €100 level, or plunging down to sort of 50 and below? What's your view here?
I mean, that's, as I always say, both can happen, right? But it's that kind of range for at least this year and maybe next year. And also it's a range that market participants have started as seeing as a, let's call it a soft floor or ceiling. And also if it's most traders' conviction and fundamentals remain more or less where we could expect them, so we have no major energy crisis, we have no macro fallout, then the question is if it could really go to 50 or 100. As I mentioned before, with the Repower EU initiative, EU is calculating with an average price of €75, which would put us actually just in the middle of your stipulated price range. But that we will go to the extreme, so 50 or 100, likely not, because you have a risk-reward ratio that starts being too attractive, right? To either buy when the market drops to or below 60 or to sell when it trades above 90. So the more likely scenario is that we would see a continuation of the sideways channel that we are seeing right now. So say around 60, 80 euros or so. Of course, depending on what's happening, right? This is a base case. If we see another energy crisis or we see something really bad happening to the economy, then we might end up even lower or higher than both extremes here.
Of course, and you know we don't have a crystal ball. That's for sure, Alexandra. But I think the other thing I also not worried about, but a question that always sort of crops up in my head is like, if as we're greening the power system, more renewables coming on board, as you've said, where's the demand for? And we're kind of trying to phase out coal, certainly by very soon. In some countries, they've already closed their last coal-fired plants. And gas is also not a fuel for the future. Where's the demand for EUAs going to come from?
Well, I mean, the last 1.5 years, they've been exceptional, right? In a way that the decarbonisation was incredibly fast. And it was that fast that the supply reduction could hardly keep up with it. And that's basically how and why we could see 50 euros earlier this year. But we have the big decline in power emissions, so over 20% for 2 years in a row now. And that is unlikely to be able to keep up the pace, at least if we look in percentage terms. So for the future, demand will be decreasing, but supply will, in our opinion, decrease faster with all the measures that being put in place by the EU, like the one already in place, the Repower EU front-loading, with the allowances missing from the auction volumes from 2027. You have the continuation of the strong linear reduction factor, reducing the cap on the market each year. And this one goes into its third year, where it reduces supply by over 80 million every single year. and due to a complex setup of adding the shipping sector to the system, which I will not go into completely because it's as I said, very complex. But overall, we expect 2026 to be short around 190 million, right? And that then we are already considering another strong decline in power emissions until then. Maybe not as strong as 2023 and 2024, but we would need a major development to turn this around into a long market, at least as it looks right now. But we also have another big factor here of uncertainty, and that is the industrial demand, because the industrial demand affects CO2 twice. So first directly through industry emissions, and second through the power demand, as we already discussed. So if we have more industrial output, we have a higher power demand, it creates more potential demand for fossil generation, and thus a stronger demand for EUAs. But we've also seen that many compliance entities didn't really follow when the EUA prices started increasing a couple of years ago. And they found themselves in a situation where they have no funds to invest in more efficient equipment to actually get emissions down. And the only thing left was and is to buy EUAs to be able to comply at the end of the year. And it's still the case for many.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've highlighted very clearly that the supply squeeze is coming. So with the planned reduction in supply, with the so-called, as you mentioned, the linear reduction factor, which will squeeze that supply every year. But what are your expectations for, like, say, from, you mentioned 26, but what about 27, 28, 29, 30? The closer we get to the key year of 2030, Alexandra?
Yeah. If we start with just the next 12 months, as I said, we see more of a sideways scenario. Of course, depending on the winter. If we have a really cold winter, we could see maybe some spikes in Q1, Q2, 2025. And then we will see prices start picking up due to a tight 2026, right? So a tight supply and a higher demand. We could also see, as this is let's say a forward-looking market, there could also be some price pickup or increase already in 2025. So someone actually foreseeing what is going to happen in 2026. And for 2026, we're looking at prices around 90 euros if we follow our base case scenario. Going up to 2030, we have an estimation of 135 euros, but that is done with the underlying assumption that of gradual nature. So we are avoiding extreme spikes in this forecast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, absolutely. I see. I think we mentioned something that's been in the news a lot and certainly affected companies globally, something we discussed actually on previous podcasts, and that's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. How do you think this will be, how will it affect industries covered by the EU ETS, specifically cement, steel, and aluminium? I mean, you mentioned the industrial demand, but how will CBAM affect these? It's a terrible acronym, but it's one that we have to use. How will that affect these industries, Alexandra?
Well, in theory, they lose one form of protection, right? And that is the free allocation within the EU ETS. And they will receive another one, which is CBAM. In practice, however, it's depending on the industries. Some industrials still receive quite high amounts of free allocation, but two things will change for them. They will have a massive reduction in free allocation due to the new benchmark values that will be published next year and put into place in 2026. And that will possibly or probably have a stronger effect on them than the CBAM itself, at least in the beginning. So let's say for the first 2 years or so. And then, of course, CBAM itself. But it looks as if the real effect from CBAM will be visible at around 2029-30, so 2029-2030, due to the gradual phase-in, right? So it's going to be, let's say, a soft start, and then it's getting worse. But we do also read a lot of stories about German industry, for instance, moving abroad. So the question is the reduction of free allocation of EUAs and CBAM in practice going to be a factor here as well?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think because that's that's obviously a key lobbying issue for German industry, and nobody at any level wants to see German industry move out of the heartland of Europe in a way. So that's certainly a worst case scenario, I'd say.
It could be a factor there, right? So, but it will also depend on other factors. So from our point of view, we see it more as the tip of the iceberg. So a factor that could actually lead to such decisions. So moving abroad, even again in theory, the system should be neutral for them.
But it's interesting. It's all the squeeze is going to come as the closer we get to 2030. It appears, isn't it? From all fronts here, Alexandra. I think that would be fair to say. Let's move on to, you mentioned, investors in the market. So we'll call them hedge funds, or basically boutique firms that look at this market and at the price developments. Now, at the moment, these investors remain quite short on balance, maybe around 7 million tons, certainly according to figures out this week, which was up from a previous 12-month low the last week. But why are they still short? What are they? How are they viewing this market? Could you explain that figure there? That's 7 million tons short, Alexandra.
Well, so these short positions, they were actually reduced quite a lot since this summer. So still in July, there were something like 25 million net short positions. So, I mean, the number has reduced significantly. And we believe that it's due to the risk of sentiment around gas, as we talked about already, and the geopolitical development in Russia. And as you said yourself, the data is always delayed. So I'm pretty sure that the short position is bigger already, because some of the fear is at the moment leaving on the gas side, and hence shorts are building up again on the CO2 side. But to your question, why aren't we long already? Because that's what you wanna get to. I think that they would be long already by now if emissions hadn't been so low again this year. Because it basically means that 2025 will likely see another flat or even slightly long year. And then the question is, how long in advance do you want to take on a trade, right? Do you want to go long now and risk not making any money with it by the end of the year? And in the end, it's a decision of how long in advance the market prices in future fundamentals, basically. And we would argue that it's probably 9 to 12 months, but not much before that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting, Alexandra. I mean, I think if we mentioned in the intro, and you've also mentioned other sort of policy initiatives, directives, etc. What other reforms to regulation are we going to see in the next few years?
I mean, we have some reform proposals coming up in 2026, and although no one knows still what they will be, we believe that the biggest one for the market is probably going to be a change in the market stability reserve thresholds, where we will see quite a big change in the fundamental balance and the total number of allowances in circulation. How this will look, we don't know yet, as I said, but it will probably be quite a big thing also to reduce the amount of allowances on the market and thus tighten the market supply, right? And then we also think that there will be more sectors entering CBAM. So we think, for example, that refining is one of those that might be a candidate because they're currently quite a big winner. They are on the carbon leakage list, which means that they will have quite a large free allocation, even from 2026 to 2030. They will actually be receiving 100% of the benchmark as a free allocation. But they are not subject to CBAM yet. So the question is if this can be justified in the long term. But we think that sooner or later the advantage will be cut.
And when you say carbon leakage, that's, correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra, but that's those companies that are deemed to be at threat of basically moving out of the EU because of the strict environmental laws. For example, the EU ETS. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Yes. So that's why they are receiving a higher amount of free allocation than other sectors, just to avoid this and keep the industry within the EU. We also see, we don't know what's going to happen in phase 5, right? So from 2031, but it looks as if the market will look quite different if we compare it to today, that we will have some new sectors in the system and the scheme. We will have different rules, other regulations, a smaller market maybe, and then the integration with the new ETS too. And who knows, maybe we will be integrated with the UK ETS as well at one point.
And but still, a global carbon price is a long way off, isn't it? I think. But let's round off today, Alexandra, by talking about these new sectors coming in. So we heard in the clip at the beginning your insight into the rule changes for airlines and the maritime industry when it comes to their emissions allowances. Can you explain how this will impact businesses in those sectors?
So for the aviation industry, it's been quite tough times for some time now, especially since COVID, right? Because basically no one was flying for a year or two. So what will happen in the aviation industry is that all the free allowance that they receive will be lost in 2026. And of course, this is a big financial burden for many. And we might see it then reflected in higher ticket prices, right, going forward. So in the end, the passengers are the one who will take the hit, if we can call it that. What has happened, though, is that in 2024 and 2025, some operators who didn't receive any free allocation in the past, they all of a sudden are receiving a certain percentage of their 2023 emissions in the form of allowances. And this has also changed the game plan a little bit for some players, because they didn't get anything for free. They had to pay for every ton they emitted, and now they've at least received something. And for others, it's also become.
But could I ask you why that is? Why are they receiving those? Why are they receiving those allowances now? Is this a compensation for losses incurred under COVID, or
no? It's not a compensation. It's just the new revised regulation, so the ETS regulation. So it's just something that was done and implemented now for 2024 and 2025. So it's got nothing to do with now we're phasing out 2026. You're not going to get anything. So we give you a little bonus, going up to 2026 now, and nothing like that. It's just following the directive and the regulation. So that has been positive for some airlines, and it's been negative for some, because some have actually still had their free allocation being based on really, really old data. So even if they have decreased their operations and their emissions, they were still receiving allowances that were based on calculations from a long time ago. Let's put it like that. So they have suffered quite a bit this year. And if we look at the maritime sector, the compliance is being gradually phased in. And the ship owners will need to surrender allowances corresponding to 100% of their emissions from 2026 in September 2027. But many owners they're passing through the cost to the charterers, so the one operating the boats, which means that they're not taking on the cost themselves. So it's not necessarily the EU ETS alone being the real challenge for the maritime sector, but the overall decarbonisation path, because there are also other regulations for maritime sector, and that will affect them maybe even more than the EU ETS.
Absolutely, but prices look like they will be rising towards the end of that data on the basis of these sectors' inclusion, as well as the supply squeeze that you mentioned. Alexandra, thank you very much for being a guest on the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you so much, Richard, for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode. Our podcast episodes are released every Friday. For the latest news from Montel, please visit montelnews.com, and you can follow us on LinkedIn and X or Twitter at Montel Group. See you next time.